our second speaker series. First, I want to like to start off, begin by respectfully acknowledging that all of us at Penn State gathered together on the traditional grounds of the Susquehannock people and thank them for their care and stewardship for this land. Let us all strive to care for it in the same way and act in harmony with our natural surroundings. Our speaker today is Professor Charles Dumas. Charles Dumas is the first African-American professor emeritus in the School of Theater, Penn State, and was the first African-American full professor at the school. He also directed the first plays written by an African-American on the main stage of the university. He was a Fulbright Fellow at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He is a community and political activist, having been at the March on Washington in 1963 and a project director during the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. He was named the Democratic Party's nominee for the U.S. House of Representatives in 2012 for the 5th District of Pennsylvania. He's also a writer, actor, director, having appeared in and directed or written over 300 plays, films, and TV shows. He was awarded an Ensemble Emmy Award for Separate but Equal and was named the Best Actor by Hollywood Beverly Hills NAACP for BC Historia. He is a recipient of the Pennsylvania Council of the Arts Grant for Playwriting. He is married to Professor Joe Dumas, who teaches in PSU here at Penn State University College of Communications. This year, the couple will celebrate their 50th anniversary. Now, my personal thing about Charles, I've known him for a long time. When I stepped foot, I went here, those who know me, I'm a professor of theater now, but I went here as a graduate student, and the first person I came in contact with was Charles, the first time I stepped foot on this campus and ground in State College. Charles, you have, I've been under direction from you as an actor. You mentored me as in academia. I've shared the pen with you about Robert Johnson, you know, at the Crossroads, and you are the man who introduced me to Africa. And I always think about you and Charles, and I'm so grateful to you, and you mean the world to me, and I stand on your shoulders, and you are a giant to me. And I am so appreciative to you, and Joe has always been home away from home where I can go get some good gumbo and just sit and be honored, respected, valued, and seen. And for that, I thank you, brother, so much. Everybody, Mr. Charles Dumas, Professor Charles Dumas.
Thank you, Steve. You're gonna make me cry, brother. That's very sweet, very lovely. And you have always been very special in our hearts and in our minds, as you know. We've walked this path together. I may have started off, you know, sort of trudging it alone, but you've joined us, and you are now, I'm following you, my brother, because you are very special, and thank you for those. And thank you all for coming to join this discussion, this lecture, this whatever it is. I'd like to go to the first slide so we can begin the process. I don't have a lot to say past that. All righty. Next slide, please. Good. This is what we're kind of going to do, and we're going to get through this kind of fast because we only have about an hour. We're going to cover personal materials. That's going to be a little piece I'm going to read to you in a minute. And then we're going to talk about constructing white supremacy in America, which is primarily through the process of the law and Constitution, et cetera. Then we're going to talk about dismantling white supremacy, which comes through the efforts of African-American folk and other folks of color and folks, good folks, white folks who have helped in that process. A little bit about the role of theater and performance, a lot about that, development of a new narrative, which is where are we now and where are we going, and then some questions and feedback. So that's kind of where we're at. I'm going to start off by reading something which appeared in the Congressional, or not the Congressional, but the Senate Daily Times. It's a little bit something about me way back when I was one of you guys, when I was younger. It's from a thing called Under the Baobab, and it's called Words Can Hurt Us. Sticks and Stones. A while ago at a local State College Justice rally in front of the Borough Building, an African-American high school student tearfully talked about being taunted and and ridiculed at her predominantly white school. It wasn't everybody, she said. It wasn't even most of the students. It was enough to make her cry, though. It reminded me of my own high school experience 60 years before. I was a senior at predominantly white De La Salle High School in Chicago. There was an incident which changed my life. De La Salle won the Catholic League championship in basketball. Marshall, an all-black team, won the public school championship. There was an annual game where the Catholic school champions played the public school champions for the City of Chicago championship. It was going to be De La Salle versus Marshall, us versus them. At a rally, one of my best friends, Douglas, shouted, "We have to beat these." And he used the N word, brothers and sisters. The word came kind of easily to him, and it hurt me deeply. I was confused. I was a De La Salle student and a Negro. If I had screamed with Douglas, I would still be a N in Douglas's world. We would be De La Salle men forever, but I would be a black man beyond forever. We have to beat these. I rode the number 3 Cottage Grove bus to school. Every day would pass projects, tenements, storefronts, then the very nice middle class up high rises of Lake Meadows. Stopping near the school just short of the railroad viaduct, it would turn to go downtown. The viaduct was the inviolable border, the militarized 38th parallel, which we blacks could approach, but not usually cross. It separated Bronzeville from the white west side, from Comiskey Park, the White Sox Park, from all good things and prosperous things. I realized that if I kept my eyes fixed on the ground to avoid looking at white folks in the eye, I might cross that viaduct. I might go where the number 3 bus could not go. In those days, Major League Baseball was often played during the day, and after school, Douglas and I and others would walk to Comiskey Park to watch the last 3 or 4 innings of a White Sox day game. We would share a hot dog or a Polish and then head home. It occurred to me that in 2+ years, I had never been to Douglas's home, nor he to mine. I had never been to any of my white classmates' homes. It was just the way things were. We have to beat those. The modern civil rights movement was beginning. At that time, 4 black students from North Carolina A&T sat in the Greensboro Woolworth lunch counter reserved for whites and asked for service. There were no segregated restaurants in Chicago refusing us service. Discrimination was rampant in other areas like housing and education. But during his northern campaign, Martin Luther King would refer to Chicago as the most segregated city in America. As a teenager, I didn't understand how to navigate the racism and the pain that it caused. One day coming from school, I went past my stop down to the 63rd Street movie theaters to see a double feature, to lose myself in the comforting non-reality of the film. I didn't return to school for a while. Some of my old patterns resurfaced. I went back to drinking Thunderbird and Richard's Wild Irish Rose with my Southside colored friends. I started hanging out on stoops late at night, harmonizing with the doo-wops. It was familiar territory. It felt comfortable. Meanwhile, my grades slipped into the toilet. By mid-semester, I was failing 2 courses. My mom was unaware of my downward spiral. I lied my way through by telling her I was at a friend's house doing homework. Lots of homework in the senior year, I said. But I couldn't hide from Father Clemens, who had gone out on the limb to get me into De La Salle in the first place. The school called to inform him of my progress, or rather lack of progress, and he confronted me. He told me I was not at De La Salle for myself. I was there to open the door for all Negroes who might come after. It wasn't just courses I was failing. I was failing everything, everybody. I was ashamed, and I felt alone. At the time, I didn't have the analysis or the words to explain. I didn't graduate that June. I didn't ever graduate from De La Salle. I got a high school diploma years later with a GED. Now, 60 years later, this young African-American woman is telling a similar story, only she is speaking to a crowd of 1,000 mostly white kids who cheer her courage. My tears come, not from pain, but from the possibility of hope. And that hope, young brothers and sisters, is that you, and with us helping along the process, are going to get rid of the white supremacy which led to that incident 60 years ago and led to that incident not too long ago. Next slide, please. A lot of the construction of this white supremacy comes from the law. I have to excuse myself because I have a background in the law and was a constitutional lawyer for a while. And so I'm going to spend some time sort of going through the process, but not a lot of law. White supremacy is not integration. It's not a process of how do we include Black folks. White supremacy is a disease that needs to be dismantled. It started in America before there was an America. Back during the colonial period and during the development of slavery, there came to be a rationale for why it was all right to enslave African people, to kidnap and enslave them. And the reason for it wasn't a rationale at all. It was about to make money. It was about the fact that it was very lucrative to enslave people and force them to work for the 20 or 30 years that you could get out of them. So even during the colonial period, from 1619, when the first Africans arrived, there was the process of the enslavement of people of a different color. But that, we can't really blame America for that because there was no America. America didn't start until 1789 with the Constitution and the rights of men and equality under the law. How about that? What an amazing process that is, that we created a representative democracy where people were equal under the law. Problem was that all people weren't equal. 20% of the people who lived in the United States, what became the United States, were enslaved people of African descent. 20%, 1 out of every 5. And what did that Constitution, which talks about the rights of men and equality under the law, say about that? It didn't say very much. As a matter of fact, it said nothing. It didn't say anything about slavery. It didn't say anything about Africans. It didn't say anything about racism or even white supremacy. But if you look at the stuff, and scholars have looked at, what does it say about the protection of property? And if you look at the 10 or 11 things that sort of apply to slavery, like the 3/5 clause and that sort of stuff, you would find that 9 out of 10 of them, or 10 out of 11 of them, deal with protecting the interest, not of the enslaved Africans, but protecting the slaveholders. So the Constitution says nothing about it. So we have to go forward for about, till the Civil War. There were a lot of white people. Of course, there were a lot of Black people who fought against slavery and ran from it and rebelled against it and did everything they could to escape it. But there was also a lot of white people who knew that slavery was wrong. They knew it. They called themselves abolitionists. They called themselves, back in those days, if you can believe it, they went into the Republican Party, if you can believe it or not. So there, what happened, whole lot of stuff, but what happened was the Civil War. And some people say, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about unifying the country. No, 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 it was about slavery, because a bunch of folks, a bunch of states in the South and the Confederacy decided that it was more important to them to keep their slaves because they were so important to them. It was more important to keep their slaves than it was to remain in the Union. And so they seceded from the Union. But the Civil War started in '61, and for the first 3 years, interestingly enough, the South was winning. They were winning the military battles. There are a whole lot of reasons for that I won't go into. But in 1863, a strange thing happened. There was a thing called the Emancipation Proclamation. Most people think that the Emancipation Proclamation was the thing that freed the slaves. No, it didn't. It only freed slaves that were in those areas that were in rebellion against the United States. Not all the slaves, not the slaves in New York, not the slaves in Pennsylvania, but the slaves in Mississippi, the slaves in Virginia, excuse me. But the important thing about the Emancipation Proclamation, in its third section, it allowed Lincoln to do something that he hadn't been able to do before that. It allowed him to bring people of African descent into the Union Army. So from 1863 until the end of the war, a year and a half later, 1865, Black people were enlisted in the Union Army. And how many were there enlisting? Well, we all know about, well, we all may not know, but there was, the Massachusetts 54th, a small company of folks who fought gallantly at Fort Wagner. But the numbers are amazing. Of the 240,000 replacements, that's from 1863 to 1865, 180,000 were Black people. So Black people replaced the Union soldiers who had been killed before, who came in and supported the Union Army and turned the war around. We all think about Gettysburg and Vicksburg as a thing that turned it, but what turned the Civil War around was that 180,000 out of 240,000. 180,000 out of 240,000. And then began the process of what should have been the destruction of white supremacy in America. And it was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They're called the Civil War Amendments. The 13th outlawed slavery except in those places where people were being serving a sentence in prison for crimes that they had been duly convicted of. That was the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was the most important because it gave equal rights and citizenship, due process and equal protection to everybody born in any state in the United States. So it didn't apply to Black people. It applied to everybody. And the 14th has been used for all kinds of things. It's been used for all kinds of freedoms of all kinds of people. And then the 15th Amendment, the last of the Civil War amendments, gave the right to vote to African Americans. And that should have been it. That should have been the end of it, folks. But it wasn't, because of those folks who had been in the Confederacy, those folks who had been indoctrinated and inoculated with white supremacy. Those people were not going to give up their power easily. They were not going to give up their position. So they created deals, a whole bunch of them I won't go through, and started attempting to take back, not slavery, not to re-enslave, but to do just as well, to bring back, using racism, to bring back their exalted position as white people in the South. Interestingly enough, we call it Jim Crow segregation and Jim Crow discrimination, where Black people lost the right to vote, lost the right to become with their brothers and sisters who happen to be white in restaurants or in hotels, lost their right to participate as full citizens. Interestingly enough, in theater and in other places, we call that same period from 1878 to 1900 the Gilded Age, the Gilded Age. And it finally got put into place in 1896 in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which allowed segregation. And segregation is really discrimination. That's how it got in place. By 1896, it wasn't constitutional, but the Supreme Court, which decides what the Constitution means, decides that it was all right to discriminate. It was all right to use segregation to discriminate against Black people. Next slide, please. So then becomes the difficulty from 1896 on, dismantling white supremacy. And it should not surprise you that the dismantling of white supremacy came through the efforts of primarily Black people, but also white people who we would call them woke now, but white people of conscience. Next slide, please. From 1877, which is the decision to remove the troops from the South, to 1954, which is we will find as the Brown versus Board of Education decision, there was resistance to anti-Black terrorism, because that's what you call white supremacy, anti-Black terrorism, led by many people. W.B. Du Bois was the first African-American to get a PhD at Harvard. He was also one of the first people to start the NAACP in 1904. There was the education process where Black people educated themselves. Imagine 1865, most Black people could not read and write. And by 1920, most Black people could read and write. And they could exercise their skills in various kinds of jobs and work. They were building back their families, building back a process of their own humanity. I call what people call the Reconstruction period, I call it the Restoration period. It's restoration of the humanity of Black people, which came through the efforts primarily of people like Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Remember, we were talking about the 14th Amendment, women's right to vote, women's participation, came out of the 14th Amendment in 1919, women's right to vote. We're celebrating the 100th year today. The Harlem Renaissance, which we'll talk a little bit about later when we talk about Black arts, etc. the Depression and the WPA, World War II in a time of prosperity. America emerged out of World War II as a world power, but a world power with a problem. Next slide, please. The Civil Rights Movement. 1954 was basically when the Supreme Court reversed that Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which said it was all right to discriminate, all right to segregate. But now the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education said the very fact that people were separated, that children were separated in colleges and not colleges and universities, but in high schools and in primary schools, the very fact that of the separation was a form of discrimination. So you could no longer separate. And so then we thought of civil rights and we thought of Black restoration as a process of integration. And somehow or other, if we could all just get together, if we could all just go to school together at first and then ultimately go to jobs and go to the restaurants and get on the buses together and walk through the parks and swim in the pools. If we could do it together, it was thought, well, then people would understand, people would care for each other because they would see the humanity of their brothers and sisters when they were no longer separate from each other. But it didn't quite work that way, brothers and sisters. It didn't quite, because white privilege and white supremacy was so embedded in the minds of folks after a couple of hundred years, and we're talking about a couple of hundred years now, that it was impossible to eradicate it just by having people be together. So they began the Civil Rights Movement to change the face of America, to change the face of it. I put it at the beginning of not just 54, because that's when the court said it, but I put it in 55. A thing happened in 1955 that some of you may have heard about called the not assassination, but the lynching of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young 13-year-old boy who lived on the south side of Chicago, just like I did. As a matter of fact, he was just about a year older. And we swam in the same pool. He wasn't a buddy of mine, but I knew him. And he went down south to Mississippi. His family was from Mississippi. My father's family was from Mississippi. He went down there and something happened. Early on, they said he whistled at a white woman. And her husband and her uncle got mad and came that night and took Emmett Till out, and they beat him and they lynched him and they buried him. His mother brought her son's body home, much the way that the mothers of the movement now who have been killed on these streets, our streets. She brought him home and she said, I want my son to be buried in an open casket because I want people to see what they have done to him. My mom took me down to the funeral parlor to view his coffin and his body. I will never forget that. It's in my nightmares often and still is there, 7 years later. But something happened with that. It wasn't the first lynching. There had been thousands of lynchings. As a matter of fact, in one year, 1919, there had been over 1,500 lynchings of Black people. There had been thousands of lynching. NAACP basically started fighting lynching. So it wasn't the lynching, but there was something that touched the hearts and minds of people, of Black people in particular, and some white people. And things started, 1955. That same year, Rosa Parks got on a bus and refused to give up her seat. Refused to give it up. And she said that she was thinking about Emmett Till. If you go back and read her biography, she'll tell you she was thinking about reading about Emmett Till when she sat there and refused to give up her seat. She got arrested, and it led to the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks. The guy that they picked to lead it was one of the new ministers in town, a guy just not too long out of divinity school called Martin Luther King. And he was picked to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. And as you know, people walked to work for over a year until finally the courts turned it around and said that they could ride wherever they wanted to on the bus, on the segregated buses. In 1957, in Little Rock, federal troops were sent to assist in the integration of Central High School. In 1960, in Greensboro, John Lewis, who just passed on not too long ago, participated in the sit-in in Memphis, Tennessee. In 61, there were the Freedom Rides. There were these things that had been sparked, not just by Emmett Till, but Emmett Till seemed to be the spark that made us stand up and say, we're not going to take this anymore. In 1963, which the reason is all in bold, is an important year in the movement. 63 was the assassination of Medgar Evers, who was president of the Mississippi NAACP. There were the Birmingham police riots. That's when King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, when his fellow ministers were saying, you shouldn't be in jail. This was the early part of the movement. You shouldn't be in jail. You should be out on the street. You're a preacher. And he said, you know, you asking why I'm in here, I'm asking why you're out there, because something wrong is going on and you should be standing up for it. That was his letter from Birmingham jail. And that all led to an interesting thing called the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. You know, it happened after the Birmingham police riots, and I was in Chicago in those days, and my church, Father Clemens, the same guy I was talking about before, he got us together and he said, we're going to go to Washington. We said, wait a minute, you know, that's down south. Washington is the south, that's Maryland. You know, that's as bad as Birmingham. We didn't know what to expect. We expected there were going to be 20 or 30,000 people, and it might be police dogs like they had and hoses and all that. But when we got there, what we found was 250,000 people, black and white. 1/4 to 1/3 of them were white people who had come together for jobs and freedom. And we sat there and listened to them. I remember sitting by on the water in the reflecting pool about 1/3 of the way toward the Lincoln Memorial with my feet in the water because it was a hot day and my feet were tired, and listening to people talk about freedom and realizing that there were 250,000 people. And that's about the time, brothers and sisters, that's about the time when I realized I was not alone, and I began to process what had happened back there in my high school. I began to process what it meant to be called an in and not be able to do anything about it. I began to process that I could get together with other people and maybe I could change the world with these other folks. That's, of course, when King had his I Have a Dream speech. Everybody remembers it. It was almost an afterthought, I was told, that Mahalia Jackson had told him in the middle of the speech, because all of us were sort of like looking at it going, oh my God, this is the last speech of the day and we're all tired and we got to go back to Chicago. It's a long way, da-da-da-da-da. And Mahalia Jackson said, hey, tell them about the dream, Martin. And he started, I have a dream. And for the next, however long time it was, we listened and he inspired us. It was a wonderful, inspirational speech. Sadly enough, there were other people listening. There were people back in Alabama listening. There were people in Birmingham listening. 2 weeks later, they put a bomb in the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, killed 4 little girls. But the movement went on. It didn't stop it. It went on. Later that same year, 63, there was the assassination of John Kennedy, who was a friend to the movement. And we all thought, oh Lord, now we're in trouble. John Kennedy, friend of the movement, has been killed. Who's the vice president? A guy named Lyndon Baines Johnson. Oh my God, guy from Texas, who was not known to be a friend to integration. Next slide, please. '64 Civil Rights Bill. I'm gonna go through these fairly quickly because time is moving on. '64 Civil Rights Bill. I went down to Mississippi, as my brother Steve has said, went down to Mississippi to help register people to vote because the vote was important. The vote was the thing that had been taken by only less than 1% of the people, Black people in Mississippi, who could vote were registered to vote. Less than 1%. There were no elected officials who were Black in Mississippi. People weren't allowed to vote in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana and stuff. So we went down to help register people to vote. We started the Mississippi Freedom Project. I wasn't alone. I was one of 200 staff people, and 1,000 primarily white volunteers joined us to register people, white volunteers, college students like you guys, risked their lives and went down to Mississippi. We weren't even there for a week when the Ku Klux Klan took James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner out and killed them and lynched them. James Chaney was a Black Mississippian, and Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner were from New York, and they were white. They were both Jewish. They were my brothers, and they fought and they died for our freedom. Later, we went to Atlantic City with our petitions for the Freedom Democratic Party. That's where Fannie Lou Hamer made an impassioned speech about what she had gone through as a Black person in Mississippi and why the Democratic Party should seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party instead of the racist regular Democrats. It didn't happen. LBJ said, no, we can't do that, because if we do that, then all the white people down south will vote for my opponent in the election in November. And we can't have that happen, because we got to defeat Goldwater. We got to defeat the opponent. But guess what? All the white people did vote for Goldwater, and LBJ won in a landslide anyway. Next slide, please. 65. Mostly we know the 65 because of the Selma to Montgomery marches with John Lewis and Martin Luther King. It's also the year remember that Southern white guy, the vice president, who we said was not a friend of civil rights, made sure that the Voting Rights Act went through Congress. He made sure, he used his power in the Congress to make sure that Voting Rights Act. So what had been what we were afraid of would not be a friend, turned out to be a great friend of the civil rights movement. Malcolm X was assassinated in the same time. Martin Luther King got the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he came out against the war in Vietnam, which was an amazing process. He also visited here at Penn State. And as a matter of fact, that visit is one of the things that inspired the development of the Martin Luther King Plaza, which is right down there on Fraser Street. Go down there and see it. It's got a whole bunch of dates that we are going through now that talk about the civil rights movement, talk about his life. But something else happened. At the same time, in 1965, there was a Watts, California, there was an insurrection. Over 30 people were killed, hundreds were injured, and places were burned. Burn, baby, burn, because the Black people, not in the South, but in the North, had a different way of expressing their anger, a different way of expressing their frustration, a different way of responding to white supremacy and having to live under the yoke of white supremacy. And it wasn't organized, it wasn't a movement, it wasn't led by folks who were, marching or carrying picket signs. It was led by people who were just angry, and taking their anger out on burning their own neighborhood. Something else happened in 65 that was very important. And that was the first commitment of the US ground troops in Vietnam. A lot of those college students that had been part of the movement back in 64, been part of the march in 63, were now up against their own struggle because they were into the draft in Vietnam. We started the US ground troops in Vietnam, and later on, there were hundreds of thousands of troops in Vietnam. The other thing that happened was that Martin Luther King began his Northern campaign, and interestingly enough, he came to my city, Chicago, to start the Chicago Freedom Movement. It was about housing, it was about equal housing. How do we break through the barriers for Black people in housing? And another thing that had something to do with the war in Vietnam was the Berkeley free speech movement. Mario Savio, who had met down and was one of the people in the volunteers in 64 in Mississippi, was at Berkeley. And one of the things that we were doing, marching against racism in San Francisco, was to go to Berkeley and ask the students to join us, and they were doing it. We had a table set up, and they were joining us. Well, it turns out that the guy who owned the very newspaper, the Oakland Tribune, that we were marching against, was on the trustees of Berkeley, and he got on Berkeley about allowing these people, these communists, to come in and register people to vote. So he told the president of the university to shut it down. Well, the students didn't like that. They thought they had a right to free speech. And so the Berkeley free speech movement, which was led in part by Mario Savio, in response to the Oakland Tribune, came up and said, we have the right. And there were hundreds of them who sat in at Sproul Hall, and hundreds of us who came over and helped them. I wasn't at Berkeley, but I was around Oakland and came over and helped them. Next slide, please. And the movement changed. The movement changed, not only because of Watts, not only because of King trying the Northern movement, not only because of the war, but it changed because Black people, leadership changed. Stokely Carmichael was in Mississippi in '64. Knew him. He was head of our section, District 2, and said something. He began to say that the Black liberation struggle should be led by Black people. Give you something. One of the things that happened, aside from the fact that Malcolm had been assassinated, but one of the things that happened was that a lot of times when we were trying to register people to vote, if I went in and asked people to vote, which would sometimes put their lives in danger, they'd refuse. But if I sent one of my white workers, one of my white colleagues in to ask the same person, they would go along, not because they loved the white person, but because they feared the white person. And what Stokely realized and other people realized was that fear of white people was a fundamental part of the white process of racism. It was a fundamental part, that fear, so that we had to get over that fear. You don't get over that fear if you have white leadership. So one of the things that Stokely said was, white people, go organize white people, and we will organize ourselves. It's also at the same time when the Black Panther Party started off in Oakland as a community group that had a school lunch program and went around and protected the community against attacks by police, carried guns around and tried to protect people from being shot at by police back in '66. It's also, for those of you who know who Muhammad Ali is, it was the year that he refused military service. He refused to go to Vietnam, and he got stripped of his boxing championship. At '67, a year later, it was the largest commitment of US troops in Vietnam, 465,600, of which 25% of Black folks made up the combat units. Good thing, Thurgood Marshall, the one who had fought the Brown versus Board of Education decision, became the first Black person appointed to the Supreme Court. But Watts continued in '67. There was a long, hot summer. The Detroit uprising wound up, it was the same as Watts. There were 43 dead, over 1,100 injured, 7,200 arrests, more than 2,000 buildings destroyed. And there were other cities, Newark, dozens of cities around the country that had uprisings. Next slide, please. '68, what I consider the last year of the Civil Rights Movement as we know it. The Memphis sanitation workers strike, which was assisted and led by Martin Luther King. He went there to Memphis to work with the workers. This was a civil rights issue. It was an economic issue. It was about the workers. And he was killed in Memphis, helping to organize the sanitation workers. Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of John Kennedy and who was a friend of civil rights. One great story about Robert Kennedy was that when King had been assassinated, he was in Indianapolis, and what he did on that day, the very night that King was assassinated, he went to the Black community. People said, no, you're crazy. There are going to be riots. And there were riots. There were riots all over the country, but there weren't riots in Indianapolis. Robert Kennedy went out and he said, I had a white man kill my brother. A white man killed my brother. And I got angry. So I know how you feel. But I say this is not going to help in terms of what we are trying to do. And people listened to him. And so there was no riot in Indianapolis because of Robert Kennedy. Well, Robert Kennedy won the California primary, and then Robert Kennedy got assassinated in June. The Democratic Party was a mess. The movement was a mess. During that summer, when the Democratic Party held its convention, it collapsed into protest and police riots. There was a Poor People's Campaign, which had begun by Martin Luther King, and then carried on by his wife, and that fell apart. It was a Howard Columbia University strike, and the buildings were occupied, and 700 protesters were arrested. And that was about the incursion of Columbia into the Harlem community, and also about the war. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this one. Go on to the next slide, please. And the next. And the next. Good. We just missed a whole bunch of my lifetime, but if you want to get together, we can sit down and talk about that at some other point. But let's talk about the role of theater and performance in the development and maintenance and dismantling of white supremacy. Next slide, please. Pre-colonial African theater. Let's talk about the people who were being enslaved first and then oppressed by white supremacy. Who were these people? These were African people. African people have been depicted, especially back in the days of Jim Crow and days of slavery, as having no humanity. And having had no humanity, they had no home, they had no God, they had no religion. All of that was lies. All of that was constructed. It's constructed to rationalize white supremacy. That if they had nothing, then we have something, so that no matter how little we had, we're talking about white people, then we're better than they are. Well, the truth is, in Africa, there was a pre-colonial African theater. When I say pre-colonial, before the Europeans started invading, it was a pre-colonial African theater. And the African theater was about the spirituality and communing with the gods. That should sound familiar, because if you think about the Greek theater from which our theater of America evolved, it started as the spirituality and communion with gods. It was also a connecting with the community. Eid al-Adha, Tabaski, is a particular religious holiday where Moses went to the mountaintop, having been told to sacrifice his son, and God said, you don't have to do that. You can do a goat instead. And so that's Tabaski. We were in Africa when that happened one time. It's an amazing process because it's done in a theatrical form. We were in a large circle with the elders on one side and the children watching, so that the children understood where they come from because they could see it acted out. And there's a use of rhythm and music. And there are characters who wear fantastic masks who represent demons and represent animals and represent heroes. My beautiful wife was asked to join in the Dumas celebration in the city that we lived in. So there was theater. It wasn't like buy a ticket theater. It was theater that connected the community, theater that was talking about the commune with gods and the ancestors. And they used rhythm and music in order to create a mood, to create an atmosphere. Wale Soyinka, a good friend of mine from a Nigerian playwright, said to me once that what you do in Western theater is that you create a theater that imitates, of the gods, that imitates the ancestors. What we do is we create a theater that invites the ancestors to come and participate with us, invites them. If you want to know what that's a little something like, go to a holiness church and watch what happens when the Holy Ghost comes down. That's the same kind of thing happening. It's the Holy Ghost. It's the creation. It is the inspiriting of the gods and the ancestors. And that's what the Africans did before the Europeans came. And dance was part of it, because dance involved not just the mind and the eyes and those senses, but involved the entire body. It involved the entire body, involved the entire being. It was very special. Next slide, please. Next, I'm sorry. Yeah. Early American theater. First of all, we know that it was secular, rooted in English culture and values. It was primarily melodrama, which really didn't work for us at all in terms of developing of stuff because of white supremacy. Because melodrama is dramatic work where the plot is designed to appeal to emotions, and the characters are often simply drawn and may appear to be stereotypes, villains and heroes and damsels in distress, you know, pay me the rent, you know, the whole thing, being on the tied to the railroad track, and the hero comes and saves the damsel in distress. Melodramas also focus on morality issues, love and marriage, and often with challenges from an outside source. But more important, there are good guys and bad guys, black and white, no nuance, little nuance. Characters are easily recognized as scoundrels or aristocratic villains or heroes. Next slide, please. And the primary example of American melodrama is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Next slide, please. It was published in 1852, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was an anti-slavery book, and it contributed greatly toward anti-slavery sentiment, which led to the Civil War. As a matter of fact, when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe after the Civil War had started, he looked at her and said, "So this is the little lady who started the Civil War," because that's how popular her book was amongst abolitionists and the people who were opposed to slavery. George Aiken adapted it into a play. It was the most popular play performed in American theater for 75 years. It is still the most produced play in American history, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sadly enough, after the Civil War, it led to the production of Tom shows and Coon shows, and all the way up to the early part of the 20th century. And it created and laid the framework and the model for stereotypes. Next slide, please. Some of these, which came directly out of Uncle Tom's Cabin, we're very familiar with. The mammy, the dark-skinned woman who cares more for her master's children than her own. Topsy came out of and created the pickaninny, black children, uneducated, no parental connection, savage in character. Even Uncle Tom himself is denigrated as a long-suffering servant, faithful to his white master or mistress. Interestingly enough, Uncle Tom is a major hero in her book. Uncle Tom is somebody who will not give up his black brothers and sisters who have escaped from slavery and is beaten to death for it. And then there's a tragic mulatto, the lost person between two worlds, usually highly sexualized. And Sambo, a good for nothing. And in the Uncle Tom's Cabin, Sambo is one of the two people who beats Uncle Tom to death. On orders from Simon Legree. Next. Another American format for the creation of the white supremacy mentality and disease is the minstrel show. Next slide, please. It was an American form of entertainment that developed in the early 19th century. It was performed in blackface and played black people or white people. Minstrels' idea of what black people were as dim-witted and lazy and buffoonish and superstitious and happy-go-lucky and sometimes even vicious. They emerged in the 1830s in the slave system and continued on into the 20th century. Next slide, please. Daddy Rice was a white man who, next slide, who went down in slave quarters. I had that upside down on purpose because I was getting tired of seeing him upright. Went down to the slave quarters to watch the enslaved people perform. He then created stereotype characters which were presented to white audience. And by 1848, blackface minstrel shows were the national art form, most popular form here. Next slide, please. What's happening with black people during this time? First time we have a sense of theatrical folks was the African Grove Theater. Next slide, please. The African Grove was one of several attempts of black folks and black theater companies in New York in the early 1800s. The African Grove was founded by William Alexander Brown, a free black man in New York City in 1821. Next slide. And one of the things about the African Grove was they put on, interestingly enough, Shakespearean plays, and they were very good at it. As a matter of fact, even though they were designed for black audiences, white people used to come to it, and a local theater company in the village, this was down in the village, saw this stuff and saw the competition and got the sheriff to raid them for obscene behavior. That's ultimately what closed them down. William Henry Brown, who was a founder of the African Grove Theater, which was the first play by a black playwright in the United States, wrote the drama of King Shotaway, based on a Gafuni chief who was a Caribbean, led a revolt of Caribbean people. William Henry Brown was from the islands himself. And so he was dealing with a story that he knew and he was trying to bring to folks. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy. The only reason we know this exists is we saw the program, but we don't have a copy of the play. But it's considered to be the first play written by an African-American on the stage here in America. Next slide, please. Ragtime. We had a wonderful production of Ragtime, which I was blessed to be in. But Ragtime was a musical style that enjoyed its popularity back in the early part of the century, as interestingly as starting right after the Plessy decision and going on through. And it was a form of music that had a syncopation to it created by people like Jelly Roll Morton, which came out of the bordellos, which are the whorehouses of New Orleans. Next slide, please. Next slide. And rag became the most popular American music. Composer Scott Joplin became famous with the Maple Leaf Rag and a bunch of hits such as The Entertainer, and he was totally forgotten. He was totally forgotten except for some people who were ragtime aficionados until the revival in the 1970s. And then his music was borrowed by Marvin Hamlish for the Academy Award-winning score of The Sting, starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford. Interestingly enough, next slide. No, go back, please, sorry. Interestingly enough, Marvin Hamlish did not give credit to Scott Joplin for the music. He claimed it for himself. And it was only when some people, some of those small dedicated community of ragtime aficionados, noticed that it was the Maple Leaf Rag and it was noticed it was from The Entertainer, did he then own up and say, well, he had borrowed the music for The Sting. And it became obviously one of the most well-known musics in revival. Next slide. The first play that we know that that we have copies of was The Escape, Leap for Freedom, came out in 1858, and again 1858, again during slavery or during the enslavement of people. And William Wells Brown went around giving tours and reading his play to raise funds and consciousness for the anti-slavery cause. And we have a copy of it. It's not a very good piece of melodrama, but he was an abolitionist. It wasn't about how good it was artistically. It was about, did it serve the purpose? Next slide, please. But we still have minstrelsy where Black people are wearing blackface. We still have minstrelsy where Black people are being buffooned. So with Clorinda, The Origin of the Cakewalk, written by Paul Laurence Dunbar and Will Marion Cook, it's the first Broadway musical to feature an all-Black cast. People were still wearing a dark face. Next slide, please. In Dahomey, written by Paul Laurence Dunbar, William Marion Cook, Jim Shipp, and it's the first Black musical to appear in a major Broadway house. It also toured Europe. It featured Williams and Walker. Burt Williams became very famous in the Ziegfeld Follies later on after this particular point. So the first musicals in America were these musicals that were written by African Americans. Next slide, please. Written by African Americans. You'll notice in Williams and Walker that Williams is wearing, so he was a light-skinned African American, is wearing a dark face because it was required. Even Black people had to wear blackface. Next slide, please. Shuffle Along, 1921. Next slide, please. Old Sister U.B. Blake, Florence Miller, Audrey, featured Josephine Baker, Adelaide Hall, Florence Mills, Freddie Washington, and a man named Paul Robeson. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but a man named Paul Robeson, one of the most famous Americans that ever lived. It was the first real crossover musical. It was very successful. And it was also the beginning of what we call the Harlem Renaissance. Next slide, please. Next slide. These are some of the artists from the Harlem Renaissance. I'm not sure why it's called the Renaissance, because to have a Renaissance, you had to have it in the beginning. So unless it was some very smart people who were harking back to Africa, where there was smart people, and there were artists who did wonderful, beautiful work, then it's really the beginning of African arts as we know it in America. Next slide, please. Langston Hughes is one of the people I selected to talk about. Next slide. Give you a sense of what his work was like. He wrote a thing called The Weary Blues. My soul has grown deep like rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. He's talking about Africa here in parts, isn't he? The Congo and the Nile and the Euphrates. And he's even talking about the Mississippi. He's talking about the Congo and the Nile and the Euphrates as if these were places that were good and positive and had dignity about them. Next slide, please. Probably his most famous play was not because of, not play, but poem, was not because of him, but because of something that came after in a minute. It's called What Happens to a Dream Deferred, Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? Dry up like a raisin in the sun. Next slide, please. Which led to the title of probably the most important play written by anybody in America, as far as I'm concerned, A Raisin in the Sun. It was written by Lorraine Hansberry in 1959. It was the first play written by an African-American woman to be on the Broadway stage. It was the first play that white people saw that normalized the lives and the feelings of African-American people. It's a family, a working class family in the south side of Chicago. Yay! They are going through a struggle that seems to be an economic struggle over what to do with the money, but it's really a struggle over their dignity. Next slide. And it has to do with whether or not they are going to move into a white neighborhood, because it's the only place they can find housing that's affordable. And make a long story short, if you haven't seen it, at first, Walter Lee, who was the tall man there, who was played by Sidney Poitier, says he will do it. He will do it. He will he will not move into the neighborhood if the white people pay him. And all the rest of the family says that's beneath our dignity. And ultimately, he comes around and he, in fact, stands on his dignity. They move in and he finds himself and he becomes a man, he grows. Next slide, please. We're gonna make it. This is the cast of that fantastic piece. Sidney Poitier, as you know, was the first African-American to win an Oscar for Best Actor. Ruby Dee was Oscar and her husband, extraordinarily famous. Lonnie Elder became a writer. Lou Gossett also won an Academy Award later on. Diana Sands was one of the fabulous. Glenn Turman's still around these days. And this is an absolutely amazing cast. But interestingly enough, maybe the most important people in that cast were down at the bottom. Ossie Davis, who was married to Ruby Dee, of course. And there's a woman named Frances Foster who came in as Ruth. Frances Foster came here to play Raisin in the Sun back in '97. She had played the other roles of Ruth and Beneatha, and she said she wanted to complete the circle and play the other woman in the thing, which was Lena. And she came here, and the Frances Foster Award is named after her because she came and shared her talents, her Broadway talents with us. It was the last show she ever did. She passed on literally a month later. And another guy who's very important is a guy named Douglas Turner Ward. Next slide, please. Douglas Turner Ward started the Negro Ensemble Company in 1967. Doug said, I was part of the Negro Ensemble Company, and Doug said he and the other guys were sitting around. All they had to do was come out at the end of the play and move furniture. And he said that they decided, well, they liked working. They liked having a job on Broadway. And how could they go about doing it? So Doug wrote an essay on the need for Negro theater, the need for Black theater. And he got a Ford grant, and they started NEC with Robert Hooks and Gerald Crone, who was a white man, who was a friend, who was an ally. And some of the other people who were involved, like you might notice Kristen Linkletter on there, and Michael Schultz, and Lloyd Richards, and Paul Mann were all part of that process. Next slide, please. These are some of the members who got their start at NEC. You might notice toward the bottom down there, Glenn Turman, and Hattie Winston, and Dick Anthony Williams, and Denzel Washington, and Sam, Lou Gossett again, all of these folks, Adolph Caesar, Debbie Allen, who got this, Angela Bassett, who started at NEC. Next slide, please. And the founder of NEC, director of Soldier's Play, which was the first real break for Denzel Washington, the writer of Day of Absence. Next slide, please. Amiri Baraka, I'm jumping ahead now real fast because I only got 2 minutes. Amiri Baraka started the Black Arts Repertory Theater in Newark and wrote Dutchman and Slave, and was a respected music critic, and changed the notion of theater. He started the Black Arts movement in the process. Next slide, please. This is Aki Shange, for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. Fabulous genius, worked and created for colored girls, which is one of the most well done performed plays still. Next slide. The Wiz by Charlie Smalls. I had the honor of working with Charlie on his next play, which didn't quite be raised to the level of The Wiz, but it was the first time an African-American won a Tony for a score and lyrics. Next slide, please. Oh, pass, go back. If you look at The Wiz, this is from the film of The Wiz, starring some people you might have heard of, like Diana Ross and Michael Jackson and Nipsey Russell and Richie Pryor. You might have heard of some of those. Well, you look down there at the bottom, you see, Charlie Smalls is a writer and stuff. Next slide. August Wilson. We were very blessed to have August Wilson come here and do his. Well, we didn't come. We did his series way before, when he was still alive, back in 2005. And he, of course, created the Decade series, where he did a play for every decade of the 20th century. All of them were, except for one, was set in Pittsburgh, his hometown, and one was set in Chicago, the first one that came out, which was Ma Rainey. Next slide, please. It's the next 5. These are in order, not of being written, but in order of being, in order of decade. Next slide, please. Susan Laurie Parks, Pulitzer Prize, first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for her play Top Dog, Underdog. You may wonder why Lorraine Hansberry didn't win. I wasn't there. Susan Laurie Parks is a brilliant young writer who is changing the face of theater, not only in subject matter, but also in style. Next slide, please. Dominic, because Dominic was here. Dominic has worked with our students here, and has worked with our brother there, Steve Broadneck, on many occasions. He's directed her stuff, and they may have a good artistic friendship. And next slide, please. Lynn Nottage is the only person, I think, alive now who has won 2 Pulitzers. but I may be wrong. But she has. She's won two Pulitzers and a couple of Tonys. Brilliant writer. Next slide. And you may have heard of this woman, because this woman, her work is about to be celebrated and performed here. Brilliant writer, brilliant actress, stage, screen, and television, and a friend, a good friend. And I am so happy that we are doing her work. And let's stay with her. I was going to spend some more time talking about modern day, but I want to spend a little bit of my last couple of minutes talking specifically about Penn State. I started at Penn State back in 1995. I came here because there had been a lawsuit by an African-American actress in the graduate acting program that still existed, because she felt that she had not gotten good roles and she had not had a good teaching, and so therefore she sued. And there was a consent decree signed by the university which didn't agree with her or disagree with her, but said we will make some changes in any case. And one of those changes was to hire a Black professor. A Black professor was hired as a woman who came out and spent a year. And then I got a call from a couple of people, one of whom is still around, Helen Mansfield, dear friend, to ask me to come out and spend a year. And I said to my agent, can I take a year off? And he said, you must be crazy. You just did a Broadway show. I was coming off a Broadway show. I had 2 films, feature films at the time. They were out. I was, wasn't the main man, but I was in them. And I had a couple of national commercials running. He said, you don't go teach when you're at the height of your game. And I said, so you got to wait until you're not at the height of your game to go teach. That something seemed wrong. And so I decided to come out anyway. I talked to my wife and we decided to come out. I love the process, but when I came out here, I love being out here with students. When I came out here, I was the only African-American in the theater department. And I was that for several years. There were only 2 other Black folks around. One was a Grace Hampton, who had moved on from visual arts. And there was a brother in the music department who was a world-class pianist. And there was Tony. And that was it, folks. Tony Leach, you don't know who Tony Leach, who started Essence of Joy. And that was it. And it was difficult in the process of talking about the need for the dismantling of the racism that existed in the department, in the college, and in the school. It wasn't people were all racist. It was the fact that there was a foundation in the department, in the school, that relied upon white privilege. And that there was a hesitancy to begin to change it. When I went and asked, at that time, the head of the department, can I do a play, can I do an African-American play? I wanted to do raising. They said, there aren't enough Black people to do raising, which was absurd because I saw Black people we had 3 actors in the grad program, and there were several in the undergrad, and there were people in the community. There were people outside of the school. And I said, of course we can do this play. And not only could we do it, but we had to do it. And then we got, fortunately, there was a director who liked August Wilson, so we did August Wilson stuff. So that there has been changes going along in the department, so that people came in, people left, but other people came in. Steve was one of those people who came in. He came in with one of the most dynamic group of students that we've had. We had 10 students, and as far as I know, you have to back me up on this, Steve. That I think that's the only one where all 10 of them graduated, all 10 of the grad students, because primarily Steve and some other folks, Herb, other folks, the African-American students formed it was the first time we ever had 4 African-American students, formed such a strong base and created such leadership that they helped their brothers and sisters along. So there wasn't the fact that they helped each other, of course, but they also helped everybody else. There was a thing in 2001 called The Village, where Black students, undergraduate, wasn't necessarily the theater students, got together and went and took over the hub and had demands to help dismantle the white supremacy that existed here. One of them was starting the African Research Center. One of them was creating some more lines in the African American Studies Department. Things like the more scholarships, more classes. People kept putting not their lives necessarily like we had in Mississippi, but putting their livelihoods and putting their dreams and putting for the good of themselves, but also for the good of others, to make this a better place. When I look around now, I see young people like yourselves, putting their livelihoods, putting their dreams on hold in order to fight for Black folks, fight for brown folks, fight for those people who are downtrodden, fight for those people who are not getting an even break. You know, all lives matter. Black lives matter. Fighting for justice. And I'm so, so proud. And as a person who represents the ancestors here, I can say that you are doing good. Thank you for inviting me to share this long-winded thing. Thank you very much. God bless you. Amandla.
Me too.
There's nobody talking.
Oh, great. Thank you, Charles, very much. I think we're going to...
We have time for questions, right?
Yeah, I'm hoping so. Let's see.
I mean, out you see.
No, you're right. No, I've been outed. I've been outed, Charles, so it's okay.
Young radicals, we want them young radicals, and they didn't know that. See,
no, not at all. Wonderful. 15 minutes for questions. So.
Sorry, I went a little over, but
No, you're fine. It was great. Thank you so much. Questions, Chris? Do I see them in the chat? Everybody is just responding, Charles, and saying what an honor and how this was awesome. Amazing. Very important history lesson. Do you have any questions? I don't.
Where's the pizza?
Right. Do you think that this current movement is getting at the heart of white supremacy? If not, what other layers need to be peeled back?
I'm going to say, in my opinion, it started on the right foot. It started on the right foot in the fact that people had a very specific things they were protesting about, and they demanded change. And they weren't necessarily saying, this is what's got to happen, but they were saying there has to be change. I think that the fact that it's coming in the middle of a pandemic, I think the fact that it is coming in the middle of an election cycle, probably the most important election cycle we've had in my lifetime, and I'm an old dude, it's gotten detracted. Remember when I talked about in the history piece about in the middle of the civil rights movement back in 64, 65, the movement was going, and then along came the Vietnam War. And that distracted a lot of folks, particularly white college students who had been very much involved in the civil rights movement, distracted a lot of folks. And it wasn't the fact that they shouldn't have been against the war, well, I'm not saying that, but the fact that their attention was diverted to something more essential to their own survival, and that is the draft. So I think that one of the problems we have is two problems that I see. One is that the possibilities of distraction from the pandemic and from all of the things that are attending to it, from unemployment process and from the election, are there. And that if people want to go off and start working for a candidate or start trying to find a job or start whatever they're doing, that's fine, but it's going to not take energy, but distract. The other problem is we can't use, well, we can't, I can't say what you can't do, but I wrote a piece that talked about Watts, because I was unfortunately there, that violence ain't gonna work. That people randomly setting fire the local police station or the local police car, or attacking other people, shooting people, or even whatever. It doesn't work. It didn't work in Watts, you know, it didn't work in Detroit. It was people out in the streets, letting go of that. I mean, clearly understanding where people are coming from. I mean, they were angry and mad and pissed off and everything else. But at the same time, in terms of effectively dismantling white supremacy, it didn't work. The main thing, the last part of that question, the main thing is, so where do you go? Well, the main thing is we have to understand that white supremacy is a problem with white people. You know, I don't care how wise I might be or might appear to be, I can't convince white folks that they got to deal with something that they have historically used as a crutch for, you know, a couple hundred years. Mm-hmm. White folks have got to deal with white folks on this issue, and it has to mean something. Let me say one. I'm repeating myself a little bit, but when I came out here because I thought I was going to be doing something for the Black kids that were isolated out here in the middle of central Pennsylvania. I found that my most valuable actions was dealing with the white kids who didn't know Black people. You know, that they had never had a Black teacher. They had the only Black people they knew on television or in the movies, and they had stereotype version coming back from you. That's what they had. They had stupid ideas. And so here's me, you know, and it was like I realized that by helping and loving, by the way, loving those kids, that it was creating more change for everybody than anything else. So that somehow or other, how do we get our brothers and sisters who happen to be melanin deficient, you know, and I'm married to one of them, you know, so it's not like, you know, they're talking about a melanin deficient person. She is seriously melanin deficient, but she is also a right-on sister, you know, raised Black kids, you know, calls herself an Irish woman of color, you know.
Yes.
You know, so that's who she is. I mean, you know, Joe. I mean, that's who she is.
Love Joe. Absolutely.
You know, and in fact, in that Tavaski ceremony in Mali, the brothers and sisters picked her up to dance. left my little butt, you know, sitting there as one of the honorary guests, and she became part of the village. You know, so that's what I'm saying. I mean, how do we, you know, how do we find? I have great hopes that we can find in this moment where everything is up in the air. Everything is up, everything is new. Whatever we do can't be wrong. You know, we gotta try it because nothing that we used to do works. Yeah. The main thing we gotta do is we gotta get white folks dealing with that problem.
A few more, if you can answer a few more. There's questions in that, so thank you everybody for submitting the questions, and there are a few. This is anonymous. We recently saw Ben Brantley step down from his position as one of New York Times theater critics. Mm-hmm. How, in your experience, have you seen the role of the critic impact commercial success or failure of shows, especially when that critic is a white cisgender male? And if you have any thoughts to share on the Wilson-Brustein debates, that would be incredible. Thank you very much.
It's interesting because the Wilson-Brustein, because I was there. I was at Yale. I wasn't at Yale Drama School. I was at the law school, but I was there, and my best friend outside of the law school was a brother who was the only Black person under Brustein at the drama school. And I have a very dear friend, I forgot her name, Fran Dorn, who was in that class before or right afterwards. And that was around the time when Lloyd Richards, who came in, and who is the most important person that nobody knows, except for people like you, of course. Yeah, I know that. But Lloyd Richards is like, Lloyd Richards found people like, you know, August Wilson, found Athol Fugard, found Wendy Wasserstein, found people who are, you know, amazing giants in our business. And he came right after Brustein. And Brustein was a fool. Yeah. And I take that not from the horse's mouth, but I take it from the people who were in the stable. I mean, he didn't have, he exhibited all of the characteristics of a person of white privilege that knew everything and dismissed that which was right there in his experience. Yeah. So August took him on. I mean, August was a Yaley too, because of and that's what I mean about the dismantling of white supremacy. Because he was in that position, then it became it was a very important position. I mean, the head of the Yale Drama School and head of the and being the critic of the Times are probably the two most important. Oh, excuse me, one of three, aside from being Rick, who is head of the
School of Theater. Yes, of course.
School of Theater at Penn State. I mean, those three positions are the three. Oh, and Steve, of course.
No.
You start naming names, you're in trouble.
No, right. No.
But you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the fact that you know, I never hung out with Ben, but I know him. When I was working with Charlie Smalls from The Wiz, it was, you know, I knew him. He was an up and coming at that time. There was another guy who was in the place at that time. So it's nice to have, that's what I mean. There's an opening. There's an opening for discussion at the Times. There's an opening for discussion everywhere. And who's going to fill those spots? You know, it used to be, and you all know this, there used to be, oh, I don't want to do PC. I don't, political correctness. No. I'm tired of that stuff. Can't we just do theater? Or can't we just do whatever it is we're doing? No, you can't. You know, no, you cannot. What you have to do is to figure out how do we make a world that is just and it's fair and non-racist, you know, and non-sexist, you know, and doesn't denigrate any people, black, brown, gay, whatever, doesn't denigrate any people, but deals with everybody with respect.
Another question, talking about respect and how to deal with everybody. How might you suggest we deal with friends, relative, colleagues who proclaim all lives matter or blue lives matter? Is this particularly, in this particularly vital, important time of race relations?
Yes. Let me say, I'm gonna give you an answer you don't want to hear. The first thing is you deal with yourself. First thing is you deal with your own inclinations toward bigotry, we will call it. We won't call it white supremacy, inclinations toward bigotry. And then you have a choice. The choice is you can take folks on and argue for what you think are other people's dignity, or you can find your own, how your dignity is involved in the dignity of your brown and black brothers and sisters. How are you involved in that? And then you make the decision about whether or not you were going to we all have issues. Let's take race out of it for a minute. We all have issues in our families where we disagree. Well, my kids and grandkids have issues with me, you know, and I know there's that look that happens when they go, oh Lord, you know, because I'll start preaching or whatever based on whatever. And I know when they're going, am I going to take dad on? Am I going to take granddad on here? You know, on this, because I know how he feels about it, but I feel as strongly, and you know, and I'm respectful, and my kids fortunately are respectful. But you know, am I going to take him on, or am I not? Am I going to let that go? So the answer is, number one, you examine yourself, and number two, you decide how important it is. How important it is to you. And if you think, get my Catholic holiness out here.
Go ahead.
If you think that white supremacy and bigotry is something that can destroy your conscience, they can hurt your soul, how much do you love that person to try to get them to on the right side of history? How much do you love them?
should we take, let's do two more, Charles, and let's go there. Michelle Dunleavy from the School of Theater asked,
Hi, Michelle.
can you talk a little bit about your own work, plays you've written, have connected to and been driven by community issues and social justice? Specifically, can you talk about your upcoming work with Osage Project and what your goals for the project are?
Oh, thank you, Michelle. I did not pay her for that comment. Osage is someone who is the son, or was the son, excuse me, he's with me still, so it's hard to say was, of Iyun and Sylvester Osage, who are from West Africa. And on March 20th, 2 years ago, his father called the police because he felt that Osage had not been taking his medication. Osage was on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, and he called him and asked if they could find him because he hadn't heard from him. And make a long story short, they got something called a 320 warrant, and 3 policemen showed up at Osage's door, knocked on the door, and 30 seconds later, Osage was dead, having been shot 4 times. There was an investigation by the district attorney and by the police department with some oversight by the state police, and decided that the police had acted according to their own, their own principles of acting. They did nothing wrong. And that race, all the cops were white because there was nothing but white cops in State College. And Osage, of course, was West African, was black. That race was not a part of it. And some of us in the community said, that's bullshit. That's bullshit. Let's have an investigation, not by the DA and not by the police department. Let's have an open investigation in terms of what really happened. And the guys are back. The guys were never, the policemen were never revealed for who they were. I mean, they are still unknown to everybody except people in the police department. So I wrote a play, really threw it together just to let people know what was going on, but it didn't come out until the summer after everybody left. And then we did it again, a workshop. And now Rick has been gracious enough to allow me to come in and do a workshop again on those incidents with students from the School of Theater and some people from the community. It's a play about social change. It's not. It's going to be a workshop about social change. My life is. I've got 3/4 of a century here, and I haven't got too much time left. But I want to make sure that I use that time well. I've been blessed to have the faculties, and I'm still got most of my health, at least 60% of it. And so I want to use it well. I mean, I look around and look at people like Maya Angelou and John Lewis and those old folks like me, and how did they use their last time? And they used it by doing what they thought was important. And so that's what it is. So I'm doing it because I think it's important that young people learn about what we call theater for social change. It's what I've committed my life to for these last probably 10, 15 years in South Africa and in here. Mm-hmm. I guess that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. One last for the night came from Mary Rose. How does the modern performances of older theatrical pieces keep us moving forward?
Say it again, man.
How does the modern performance of older theatrical pieces keep us moving forward?
Have you seen Hamilton? Have you seen you don't get no more older story, not necessarily performance, but older story than the story of the founding of the country. You can't get more older than that. That is the beginning of the country. And have you seen what Lin-Manuel and all those folks, and Chris, my brother Chris, have you seen what they're doing? They are telling a story that, that is as modern and as forward thinking as anything that anybody could do in a style that is rap.
Yeah.
yeah, it's not about what the tale is. It's about who tells it, how they tell it, and who they're trying to reach and what they're trying to say. You know, yeah. I mean, just I don't have that. That's the answer to the question. The answer is Hamilton. Yes, you do old stuff, but at the same time, you don't do old, historic stuff to and not do stuff that's coming out of the mouths of babes, for lack of a better word, out of the mouths of the young. That all of those things are part of the canon. All of those, it's when you exclude stuff because it's the wrong style or the wrong color or the wrong idea. I mean, that's when you get in trouble, when you start excluding stuff. But yeah, man, yeah, shoot. I saw, what was that thing we saw in the park 2 years ago? Oh man, do you remember, Steve?
Was it the one of the Shakespeare's?
Yeah.
Yes.
Was it with our student? Because I think Denzel. If it's the last 2 years, I forgot which one.
No, it wasn't Denzel. It was
Much Ado. Was it Much Ado?
I think it was Much Ado. But
Yeah.
huh? I think it was Much Ado. And I'm sitting here going, number one, that brother down there at the public used the process of going out into the communities, and this time not just doing Shakespeare in the Park in Brooklyn, but getting those people in Brooklyn on the stage in order to involve them in the process. And some of them wound up in the park on the stage. So there became this interesting Much Ado with this mixture of as a matter of fact, if you want to look at it, part of my idea of getting people from the community together with the students comes a little bit from that. How do we get folks, you know, mingled and together and create, you know, wonderful, good stuff? You do that, Steve. I mean, you're cutting edge, man. You are what's happening, you know.
Thank you, Charles.
No, you are, man. You're the man.
I'm learning from the best, man. I'm learning from you over the years.
That, but you know, hey.
Yeah, man, learning from the absolute best. Charles,
let me. I got to answer S. John.
Okay.
Assume a black person tragically killed by a police officer, only killed because I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I said that a white cop, because I know he's white only because that's all they got, that a white cop killed a black man who was 29 and everybody said race had nothing to do with it. One of the things, first of all, I don't think he was killed because he was of his color. I think he was killed because he was like that thing that we had in the streets last night. He was a bear. I think one of the things that happens with white supremacy is that a lot of white folks, especially white folks who are in quasi-military circumstances, begin to think of black men as beasts. Going back to that stuff I talked about in terms of stereotypes, that when you see a black man, especially a black man with a knife, oh my God, you know, that's someone who's trying to kill me. Well, it could also be a young man who is off his meds. And then maybe the thing to do, I'm not saying I wasn't there. See, that the question is, we don't know because we weren't there. That maybe the thing to do is to leave, is to back off, you know, and not be so close. I'm not saying, see, so as John, brother or sister, whatever, I'm not saying he was killed because of his color. I'm not saying that he was out there hunting black people to kill him. I'm not saying that. I am saying that the way white supremacy works is that it makes us enemies. I have to deal with my own bigotry in terms of white people because, as I was saying back in Mississippi, because I don't want to be afraid of white people because of their implicit power. Because what's that going to make me do? It already made me leave school because I was afraid, because I didn't have the process by which I can address the issue, change my life. I wound up leaving school because I couldn't deal. I want to make sure we can all deal, man. You know, we can't deal if we don't talk. And if we don't love.
Absolutely, Charles. Well, and I'm gonna give you one last, let's close out with one more because Carrie Love, I want to get you in. Do you have any book recommendation in regards to the cultural history of African performance? Any book recommendations?
First of all, the United Nations put out a series of, I think it's 10 books on all aspects of African life, history, etc., written primarily by Africans. It's the United Nations book, and one of the books is on culture, and it's all of Africa. I mean, it's like, you know, and I would, if you really are interested on the level of really want to know, talk to the people who did it. Talk to the African folk. You know, that's the first thing. There are so many things coming out now. Kokora has access to them. Steve has access to them. I'm going to defer to them because, you know, I'm the old guy telling stories about old times. They're there. They're doing it, and they're in contact and communication with people who are current. I am not current, except with my beloved wife. So I'm gonna defer that answer to, you know, to you guys, particularly Steve and particularly Kokora.
Yes.
Particularly.
Everybody, Rick is saying thank you so much. Charles, it's always an honor to get to sit with you. I don't get to do it enough because running around, but I'm so grateful.
A lot of work, brother. Sure.
I am grateful for you and honor you, brother. Thank you so much for tonight and all that you do and have done for all of us. I know I speak for Kokora, Wendell, and anybody who's come across through you. We all appreciate you. So thank you very much and love you. Love you. And Joe, I know she's sitting there. We love you all, family.
Yeah.
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 All right.
You too, man.
All right. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.